Hello, everybody. My name is Astrid Weins. I am the Vice Chair of the Winthrop Board of Health, and today I'm hosting two ladies from the Northeast Massachusetts Mosquito Control and Wetlands Management District, Kim Foss.
Good morning.
Right here next to me, and
Kelsey
Evans, the field technician. Kim is an entomologist that is an insect specialist, and she's going to talk to us today about mosquito control efforts in Winthrop and what we can do to prevent mosquito breeding in the area. We're also going to cover how we do larviciding, meaning breeding prevention for mosquitoes in Winthrop, and what we do when we do have too many mosquitoes, what options we have in Winthrop to fight them. And we're also going to talk about West Nile virus, the disease and the risk in Massachusetts and in Winthrop right now in 2018. And we're going to cover a little bit about Eastern equine encephalitis, another very, very important but not very prevalent disease in this area. So what we're going to start with today is talking about our mosquito infestation we had this year in Winthrop and all over Massachusetts. And I'd like to talk what kind of mosquitoes they were. And as you can see on the slide here, our problem this year originated in the salt marshes surrounding Winthrop. Can you explain a little bit about these kinds of mosquito species, why they breed there, and why this is a problem?
So there's about 3 different mosquito species that are called salt marsh mosquitoes. There's different kinds that come out different times of the year. In all, in Massachusetts, there's 52 to 54 different kinds of mosquitoes.
Right.
So, you know, at any daytime biters, nighttime biters. The salt marsh mosquito species breed in salt marsh soils, so they find areas that have dried, that re-wet, and they lay their eggs on the perimeter, and those eggs can stay viable for many, many years until reflood. So there's quite a bank of mosquito eggs on any given salt marsh. During certain years when we have astronomically high tides, which they cycle on certain years we get higher tides, other years we get lower tides. There's a peak cycle of tides. Mixed with the rain that we had this year, if freshwater rain falls on a salt marsh, the soil is saline, is salty, so it creates saline pools even though the rainwater is fresh. So it can act or mimic a tide, a flooding tide. Now the flooding tides have to come up to the marsh and then recede, and it only is in small pockets that are too shallow for salt marsh fish or saltwater organisms. Salt marsh mosquitoes won't breed in areas that contain fish or areas that flood and reflood several times a day with high and low tides. So it's mostly upper marsh areas that are restricted from predators and other things like that. So that can cause spikes in salt marsh populations. So if you have several years of drought, you still have mosquitoes that are laying eggs on the perimeters of these wet pools that aren't wet.
Right.
Then you get a wet year, and all of a sudden, this bank of eggs can hatch.
Right.
And once that hatches, you can have hatch after hatch, depending on how high the water line goes up, you get a fresh batch of hatching. If the water comes up some more, those eggs hatch.
Right.
So basically, up and down the eastern seaboard, all the way to Florida, this happens, mixed with rain and storm events, with tide events. And the weather pattern that we had this summer was a prevailing kind of a southwesterly or southern coming up the Appalachian Mountains. It was kind of following that tropical weather pattern coming up the coast, mostly when we started in late July through August. So salt marsh mosquitoes are also a very long flying, carrying mosquito. They can be carried on wind currents up to 50 miles in a radius from any breeding site.
Could that be why some areas of Winthrop, like the Highlands or even the Point, or some higher lying areas like Summit Avenue had really bad mosquito problems this year?
Yes. A lot of mosquitoes, they'll start out in a low-lying swamp area or salt marsh area, and if wind currents pick them up, they'll travel on those wind currents. And if the wind currents pick up in higher elevation areas, and that's where the wind currents tend to flow, those mosquitoes will be carried into those higher elevation areas. And then, you know, they may settle and rest for the day or night in these grassy other wet areas, which may not be salt water, but they'll hang around these areas because it's damp and moist. They won't be able to lay their eggs or breed, but they do like that moist vegetated area, so they'll kind of settle in and find where to hang out for the rest of the day or night. So that's what we see a lot.
Yeah, because I've heard some residents complaining that when they walk through their yards and the grass, you know, they fly up and they start biting. So are those mosquitoes very aggressive mosquitoes?
The salt marsh mosquitoes, the late season salt marsh mosquitoes, Aedes sollicitans or Ochlariatus sollicitans, is an extremely aggressive human biter.
Yeah.
They'll bite during strong winds. Sometimes they'll even bite with the use of repellent. They'll aim and try to bite you, but they won't fully attach and feed, which is the best reason why to use repellent.
Yeah.
But yes, they attack vehicles. They'll get into homes. The minute you walk onto a marsh or in a wet area or in an area that has grass that's unmowed or heavily vegetated or shady areas, they will attack you aggressively. So, and they're day biters, so they're very aggressive day biters.
Yeah, but they're not usually active during the nighttime, right?
No, they like to rest. They're one of the few species that actually rests during the nighttime.
Okay. Good. And so I heard also some questions from residents where they asked me why we don't do aerial spraying, meaning helicopter spraying of the marshes in our area to fight those mosquitoes, because that's what's commonly done in many other towns and areas of Massachusetts. Can you explain why that is not possible here in Winthrop?
Yes. In the northern part of our district's boundaries, we can treat and larvicide these areas by helicopter. Down in this section, the southern part of our district, because of our close proximity to the airport, the regulatory agencies don't allow us to fly helicopters around because of the in and out paths of the prevailing aircrafts.
Yeah, so that creates, you know, a little bit of a conundrum for us. We are very exposed to those mosquitoes, but we can't really effectively do anything about them. But there's good news to that. What's the good news, Kim?
Well, some of the good news is we do larviciding, so we'll walk these marshes out and we sample and dip to make sure there is no breeding in these high area pockets that may collect water. And larviciding is a very good proactive approach.
And then how about the virus carrying potential of those mosquitoes?
And the other good news is they can carry the virus, but they're not very good transmitters of the virus. They've been known in a lab to be able to test positive for carrying West Nile virus and Eastern Equine Encephalitis. However, because of their genetic makeup, the virus doesn't seem to replicate to a high enough dose in their system to transmit efficiently like other mosquito species. So they can, but the likeliness of it is low.
Okay. So let's go to the next slide and review a little bit the weather patterns in the recent past. So in this year, we had more rain than usual. As you can see on the slide, we had everything that is green and yellow means it's more rain than in a usual year, more precipitation. And everything that is orange and red shows that there is less rain than usual. So as you can see on the Cape and in southeastern Massachusetts, there was less rain than usual. But in our area, and especially in western Massachusetts, there was more rain than usual. So we did have, as you already said, a kind of a wet year this year. And on the next slide, this is the drought status in 2016, where we had a lot of drought in the area. It was an extremely dry year. So if you can see on the slide, all the orange means this is a drought, watch or drought advisory. So we had a very dry year in 2016. When you compare that to 2018, we have literally zero drought this year, meaning it was a very wet, unusually wet year this year. for all of Massachusetts. And this created, you know, good conditions for mosquitoes of any species to breed, including salt marsh mosquitoes. And if we go to the next slide, here this shows us the temperatures in this year. And as you can see, all the red means temperatures are higher than normal. We had an incredibly hot year this year as well. So we really had kind of tropical conditions here. Is that fair to say?
We did. We had very good conditions for a typical West Nile virus year. With early season dryness and then later season rain. We had a lot of late seasons such as July, August, September rain. Early season was still a little bit dry, but in a normal West Nile year, we more or less dry years, we see high West Nile virus numbers. When we have a year where it's half dry, half wet, we kind of see the setup for it. Where the birds and mosquitoes are all trying to get water from the same spot, so you can get a lot of bird amplification of virus, because the West Nile virus is in birds. Mosquitoes feed on birds, pick up the virus, and then feed on other birds, which multiplies the virus in a bird population. If you have mosquitoes and birds in one spot feeding off the same little puddle of water, then you get an amplified West Nile virus year. What happens for the rest of the year, where we get more human cases, is as we get more wet conditions, you get more other mosquitoes, and those other mosquitoes are your bridge vectors. They're the ones that bridge the virus from birds to mammals, like people, humans, and other animals. So that's kind of where we had this year where we had high West Nile likeliness in the early season, and then the transmission rates and positive pools that we had in other mosquitoes later in the season.
Yeah. Thank you. So can we go to the next slide? And now I think we've talked a lot about the marsh mosquitoes and the weather patterns leading to mosquito infestations and a really bad year for West Nile virus this year. But now we're going to talk about the diseases that these mosquitoes, not the marsh mosquitoes, but other mosquito species can carry and bring to our population. And we're going to cover especially two very important ones. One is Eastern Equine Encephalitis, which is a very devastating disease, but fortunately, I should say, fortunately it is incredibly rare in humans. But when you get it, it can be a very deadly disease. And the other one we're going to cover is West Nile virus, which this year is extremely active. I should say Eastern Equine Encephalitis not very active this year, but we have a very active year for West Nile virus, and we should talk about that and maybe go over some of the details. So what kind of mosquito transmits these diseases?
So in Eastern Equine Encephalitis, it's a different mosquito. They're usually wet years, and it's birds that fly into red maple swamps, swampy areas where normal songbirds go to lay eggs and raise their chicks in the early spring. So those require wet years, you know, where it's wet throughout the year. There's one species of mosquito called Culicida melanura that lives in red maple swamps and is the first mosquito to feed on these infected birds every spring. And that can amplify West Nile, Eastern Equine Encephalitis. And then other species, which may be the same bridge vectors for West Nile, pick it up in the rest of the year to transmit to humans. But Eastern Equine Encephalitis is mostly in areas that have these red maple swamps, more wet, low-lying, heavy vegetated, forested areas that aren't so open. It's a freshwater area. So a lot of your rural northern areas of Massachusetts and southern near the cranberry bogs and things like that that have these swamps. They're the ones right now that if you drive through and you see red leaves, those are your swamp areas, the ones that now are changing color where everything else isn't.
So we don't really have these areas in Winthrop, right? So there's really very little concern that we have these kinds of mosquitoes breeding in our town. And then what about West Nile virus? What kind of species are you worried about there?
Those two, the primary vector and the ones that transmit it from bird to bird, are Culex pipiens and Culex restuans. Culex pipiens' common name is the house mosquito, meaning that in the fall or winter, they actually come into homes or terrestrial areas. They stay as mosquitoes through the winter. So they hibernate. So they have a tendency to go into homes and hibernate through the winter, and then come out in the spring, et cetera, et cetera. So those mosquitoes are ones that primarily feed on birds. They're the ones that are responsible for early season transmission of when the birds come up from the south. They roost and lay their eggs and nest. These mosquitoes will feed on these birds in the evening and dawn and pick up that virus and be able to transmit it to other birds.
Okay.
They're a very meek species.
Okay. Yeah. So can we, maybe we should briefly talk about symptoms of those diseases. So can we go to the next slide and look at that for our residents to be able to recognize these symptoms. So for West Nile virus, the incubation period is from 3 to 15 days following a mosquito bite. So when you've been exposed, you know, in the next 2 weeks, you basically have to watch for symptoms. And the symptoms are incredibly variable, and that's kind of interesting about it. You know, you always just hear about meningitis and encephalitis and really the bad cases, but the truth is that in 80% of all cases, meaning 4 out of 5 infections, we won't even know that we are infected. We might have no symptoms. We might have very mild symptoms like a cold or something like that, and we would never be tested for it in these conditions. And then 20%, which is about 1/5 of patients, will have West Nile fever, which is characterized by body aches and sort of flu-like symptoms, sometimes maybe swollen lymph nodes or, you know, generalized headaches and rashes. And then only less than 1% really present with meningitis that we usually hear about, encephalitis or meningitis or poliomyelitis. And these are the cases that are usually being tested from hospitals and being sent into the state lab for testing for West Nile virus. So that's important to know for our residents as well. So if you have any of these symptoms where you have really high fevers, neck stiffness, headache, that's when you really need to be concerned and go to the doctor right away. Can we go to the next slide, please? For Eastern equine encephalitis, the symptoms are very similar to the severe form, the neuroinvasive form of the meningitis form of West Nile virus, in that you have headaches, high fevers, lack of energies, but it could be much more severe. It could really lead to seizures and coma, and 2 out of 3 people infected with this disease will not survive. And so this is very severe, but the concern in Winthrop for this is extremely small. I mean, obviously, if you travel to areas where there's EEE, which we call it also, Eastern equine encephalitis, endemic, you need to protect yourself extremely well by using repellents and wear long clothing, because there's nothing you can do if you get bitten. You might get infected. And, but we don't have that here in Winthrop at all.
So the risk is very low.
The risk is extremely low. And when we look at the risk categories actually in Massachusetts, which you can see on this slide here, the green areas are remote risk for Eastern equine encephalitis, and the blue areas are still just low risk. So nothing in this year is above low risk, and I think we only had 2 mosquitoes that tested positive in the whole state thus far this year.
Correct.
So no human cases reported in Massachusetts. And then let's talk a little bit more about the West Nile virus carrying mosquitoes. These are the mosquitoes that you see here. What is this species? What are these pictures showing us, Kim?
So on the top left is Culex pipiens female, and then on the bottom right are the larvae associated with that species. So mosquitoes in half their life cycle are aquatic. They will lay eggs. These particular mosquitoes lay egg rafts. So it's like a little boat that sits on the water and floats. And when the eggs hatch, they can be up to 150 of these larvae in each egg raft.
Oh, wow.
And when they hatch, the larvae go into the water, and as long as the water stays there for 7 to 14 days, stagnant water, these larvae mature. They go through different stages. They get larger. And then after their last instar, which is the 4th instar, they turn into pupae. And the pupae are little comma-shaped mosquitoes. And those will stay like that for a day or 2. And then they hatch, and once they hatch, they come out as adult female mosquitoes.
Okay. And then let's go to the next slide and see what we see here. So what does this slide show us? Can you explain a little bit?
So these are great habitats for these Culex mosquitoes. And again, Culex mosquitoes are the primary vector for West Nile virus. They're the ones that are responsible for transmitting from bird to bird, amplifying the virus in the bird population. So we have mostly their man-made container species. They like kiddie pools, bird baths, clogged gutters, tires especially, flooded lawns, anywhere where water can sit that has high nutrient content. So anything that has degrading leaves in it, that has grass in it, things like that, and has any water, then the water ferments the material and it creates a really good habitat for Culex species to breed.
Right, and I think it's important to mention too that those could be incredibly small containers. You could have a glass of water standing in the backyard and that could be infested by mosquito larvae, or you could have, you know, a flower pot that you don't attend to that isn't well drained and that could breed mosquitoes, or you could have a child's toy in your backyard, you know, that the child hasn't played with in a month that's just sitting around on the lawn. Those are extremely good breeding grounds for these kinds of mosquitoes. Now, can these mosquitoes breed in salt marshes, Kim?
No, they don't. They're a freshwater mosquito. Anything that can carry fresh water, they don't like any saline at all, so no percentage of saline. We don't see that. We see some other species that may do that, but this is not one of them.
Right.
They strictly freshwater, unchlorinated, stagnant freshwater.
Okay. So the best thing that residents can do to prevent these mosquitoes from breeding in our town is
Clean your containers.
right.
Cover, you know, get your tarps have to be clean. Make sure your boats are flipped over. Make sure wheelbarrows, anything is clean, either cleaned, emptied, and refilled with fresh water, such as bird baths, clean them once a week, or tip the container over so it doesn't collect water,
Okay.
including pet dishes.
Right. Can you say one thing about, you know, you can buy these little pellets at the hardware store that you can drop into your water collection containers. For example, some people like to water their backyards with rainwater barrels. You know, what can you do to prevent mosquitoes from breeding in these barrels?
A lot of times screening will work very well. It prevents the mosquitoes from flying. You can buy mosquito screening and you can cover your rain barrel with that, either with tie it or something, but it prevents the mosquitoes from getting in there to lay their eggs. So you can
Okay.
still utilize your rainwater if you wanted to. A lot of the other times they do sell a product that residents can purchase, and it's a bacterial product. You have to read the label specifically, and it's only for using in containers that aren't sourced to groundwater. You're not allowed to treat any area that has connections to groundwater with a product that's not licensed by a registered applicator, such as
Okay.
our district or a private company.
Okay.
So we have insurances, and there's pesticide board regulates all applications of pesticides.
Right.
So you have to be licensed.
Okay.
But they do have products that you can use in your pool, above ground pool, that you
Right.
can use in your tires.
Yeah.
Or if you have a boat you can't flip over and it collects water and you can't drain it, they do have, but you can't put them in wetlands, you can't put them in catch basins. You know, and you can't apply any of those home products to
Okay.
neighbors' properties and
So
things
really
like
the
that.
best way to prevent these from breeding is to not have any containers, or if you do, cover them
'em
with
over, right,
mosquito
or- yep.
screening.
Or
Okay.
tip them over.
Great. And then really make sure that, you know, all residents should make sure that their yards are clear of you know, junk and tires and kids' toys and old equipment that is never moved and it's just sitting there all summer,
Right.
you know, breeding mosquitoes.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about how you test for mosquitoes and what the current status is in Massachusetts and in Winthrop for West Nile virus testing.
So the first slide you're showing here is basically areas in Massachusetts, the different counties that have had West Nile virus positive events, mostly in mosquito pools. And a pool of mosquitoes is a bunch of mosquitoes of the same type put into a vial and sent to the lab for testing. That's what we call a pool. We can say they're a batch. It's a batch of mosquitoes. So this is based on how many batches per county or have come back with that have identified with West Nile virus in their county. And numbers aren't specific, but they're just showing you that the red are the highest numbers of mosquitoes that have come back based on what they've sent in.
Yeah, what I find interesting about the slide is that we can see that the urban areas, the areas around big towns, big cities, seem to have more West Nile virus positive mosquitoes. That might probably be due to the fact that people have things sitting in their backyards, that there are a lot of, catch basins and a lot of breeding habitats for those kinds of mosquitoes. Is that fair to say?
Correct. West Nile virus is more of an urban problem.
An urban problem.
Because of
right.
all the artificial containers that people have.
Okay. And then on the next slide, we see how many human cases we had reported this year. And it actually kind of goes very well with the numbers of West Nile virus positive mosquitoes. So obviously the human cases will always trail, the positive mosquitoes because they get bit and then they develop the disease. And so again, in the urban areas, we have more positively tested humans, and in the rural areas where we don't really have West Nile virus so abundant in mosquitoes, we also won't see as many cases.
The other thing is some of the other areas may not be testing or sampling that frequently, and then the density of humans is not there either. So you also have density of mosquitoes, density of testing, and density of people.
That's right.
So we also see, there is a little bit of bias in sampling, but it does show an overlap. But just because there's no human cases in the western part of the state does not mean that West Nile virus isn't there.
Okay.
That I do want to make sure that we understand that just because we don't test mosquitoes or there's no sampling or there's no data doesn't mean that it isn't there.
Okay, well that makes a lot of sense. So that means basically, the areas that are in red, also for the mosquito testing, they're just testing a lot more mosquitoes than the rest of the state. So we don't know really if there really is more abundance of West Nile virus here than in other areas of the state, because there are areas, including some towns, that are not testing at all. Is that correct?
Right. But I mean, the abundance would be in the city areas.
Right.
But if you have an area that doesn't have any data at all, it doesn't mean that we may not be collecting.
Okay.
So they can't go, well, since there's West Nile here, let me go to the west. And it'll be fine there.
Yeah.
There still may be infected mosquitoes, and the risk is still the same.
So really, I think what we need to message to our residents is that anywhere they go, they have to protect themselves.
Correct.
Because they could be exposed in any part of New England at this time.
Correct. Absolutely.
Okay. Great. All right. Then we want to talk about the risk categories. This is an important thing because that's been in the news and it's been, very wildly discussed anywhere in Massachusetts and also here in Winthrop, because obviously people are concerned, which is understandable given all these mosquitoes we've had, which are apparently almost exclusively salt marsh mosquitoes. But obviously people don't know the difference. They can't tell the difference between a salt marsh mosquito and a virus-carrying mosquito. That would be nice if we could do that, but that is very hard for a lay to do. So people are concerned about West Nile virus, and I think the messaging from the Department of Health in Massachusetts is that the risk has been increasing over the summer. And maybe we can run through the next few slides and show how the risk has increased since July. And you can tell the more yellow there is, the higher the risk. So the yellow is moderate risk. And then when we get all the way to August and August 20th, they put the whole state on a moderate risk. And then starting on August 27th, we see Middlesex and Suffolk counties being put on high-risk advisories for West Nile virus, and this is the current status. And Winthrop is part of the high-risk area, so we should be aware of this. But that doesn't mean that you cannot get West Nile virus anywhere else in the state, and so
or in the Northeast.
Or in the Northeast,
right?
Yes.
And because even if West Nile may be transmitted better by night mosquitoes, if you go into a habitat where these night mosquitoes are resting, you can still be bitten
Right.
during the day.
Right.
So a lot of people that go on nature walks or hikes in other
Right.
parts of the state or other states, Maine and New Hampshire or even Connecticut, they can still be bitten
Yeah.
by a potential mosquito. So we have to look at all mosquitoes. If people can't tell the difference or know what habitats one lives in or what time of the day,
Yeah.
that's why the general messaging for the state is the hours of activity for you, if you're going to be outside,
Right.
either stay in
Yeah.
or wear repellent.
Sure.
Because you can't be sure. Sometimes later in the season when there's just that one mosquito, that could be the one.
Right.
And you never know. So, basically you have to kind of make sure that you take personal protection methods. When the state starts giving that messaging, we usually see it July, all the way through to the first heavy frost. And the first heavy frost is 3 consecutive days at 32 degrees, which is still
Right.
quite a ways away.
Yeah.
So, the potential for these mosquito-borne diseases can go all the way into fall when people would least expect being bitten by
Right.
something, or they might get bit once and not think of it. So there's plenty of repellents out there and things that people should do. But that's first and foremost, is no matter where you go, the
Protect
risk
yourself.
is there. And just because it may not be in a town, mosquitoes don't play political boundaries. They,
Right.
so that's
We
the
can't
thing.
keep
Or
them out.
states, they don't say, well, I'm coming into this state, I'm going to stay out. That's not what happens. So
Right.
realistically, the best thing to do is treat it like you do with ticks. Is anytime you're outside recreating or even in your own yard, you just need to be
Yes.
aware that
Absolutely.
any mosquito can bite you at any time.
Right.
And that's just how it is.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Let's talk about numbers. People want to know numbers. So in Massachusetts, we have the state lab has tested about 6,000 mosquito samples to date this summer, which is really crazy. That's a lot of mosquitoes that are tested. And out of those, about 10% seem to be positive for West Nile virus. Can you talk a little bit about, is that all mosquito species that you're testing? Or are you testing only the ones that are supposedly high-risk carriers for West Nile virus?
That's exactly right, Astrid.
Okay.
In our collections, we put out different traps, which you'll show in future slides. Through those traps, someone like me, an entomologist, identifies each mosquito to species. And after we've done that, we stick them in these little vials, which we call a pool. It's easier to say batch. And those batches go to the state lab for testing. Each district, mosquito-controlled district in the state, does that.
Yes.
And we only send mosquito species during certain times of the year that may present a risk in transmission. We have different traps set up, and each trap we use for specific reasons, and we'll go through those slides. But probably only about 15 out of the 54 species we send in for testing.
Right.
To see either as a indicator species or what the status is of risk later on in the season.
Right. And then on the right side of that slide, we are showing the numbers in Winthrop. So you tested a bunch of mosquito samples. You collected 65 mosquito samples. And can you tell us why you didn't test more?
We didn't collect more. The other thing is, too, is we have stations where these traps are set. And the stations are, the CDC has recommendations on sampling protocols. We want historic trapping data because we can't make a comparison from any given year to another year if we move these traps around all the
Right.
time. So we have stationary trap sites that we try to keep. If we have to change them, we have to come up with an explanation.
Right.
Then we still look for a good site, which is usually a densely populated area.
Right.
Again, if we don't collect many mosquitoes, we can't send many mosquitoes. We had a trap change this year. We had a trap at one location, and there was a major construction project. It was Miller Field project. We were getting a lot of mosquitoes there before the construction project because there was a collapsed or a vacant sewer pipe that was running across the field. And after that was removed, and also the two ditch canal, the ditches were cleaned and repaired.
Right.
We weren't collecting any mosquitoes. So basically, I
Interesting.
had to move the trap. And
That's very
so we had Culex species that were breeding in this abandoned sewer pipe that was left between the field and the golf course.
So the Culex species are the ones that can transmit West Nile virus.
They're the
correct?
ones that transmit it from bird to bird. They're
Okay.
our early indicator species.
early
If we
indicators.
say if we see West Nile virus activity in the area, those are the species we see it in first.
Okay.
Then that puts us on a higher alert to do more larviciding and things before
Okay.
we get it in other mosquitoes that can transmit it to humans.
Okay, I understand. So basically, you're saying that due to the Miller project, Miller Field project, and also the repair of the Lewis Lake Gate, we have seen a large drop in mosquito
In those container breeding mosquitoes.
activities
Yeah.
in that area, which is really great, and an unanticipated effect of this construction project. So we should
Right.
probably tell our residents that there was
Yeah,
a
I
lot
mean,
of good that this project
Just the
did.
removal of that pipe, and then I guess the field also wasn't being used as frequently, so it had
Yes.
some containers and things that were,
Yeah.
left there, dumped there, and
And
since the whole area was cleaned up, it's
Yeah.
been a big
And
improvement.
how about these ditches that run along the golf course? What do you know about breeding activity in those? Because we had some resident requests about that.
Yeah, they're salt marsh water. They
Okay.
come in and out with the tide. They do flow nicely. Even if there's vegetation in there, when I look at them, they're flowing. They have fish in them.
Oh, wow.
Anytime we
Really?
they'll come in and out with the tide. So when we see fish or predators in water, we don't see a lot of mosquito breeding. We may get one or two, but it's not to the level that we deem necessary for treatment. We're looking for high numbers of stagnant water with a lot of larvae. Some pools, we have pictures on our website, which we'll show later, where we can do a dip, especially on the salt marsh, and it'll be thousands in a dip. So if you can imagine a thousands in just one small pool the size of a table,
Right.
times how many acres of salt marsh there is that's
Yeah.
available for breeding,
Right.
we do have areas in the state that breed a lot more than, getting a few, a couple mosquitoes.
So
here and there.
basically, the fish will eat the larvae.
They do.
And so we won't have a big mosquito problem coming
Right.
from these flowing, flushed out with the
Right.
tides, ditches and areas.
Correct.
Well, that's great news.
Yeah,
Great.
it is.
Yes.
So I had to move the trap. And the trap I moved it to was another area of interest, and because we do have a combination of these two traps. One collects human biters, one collects bird biters, and still not much. So
Okay.
whatever I could get, I did send in. I did have a few residents that asked me to set up supplemental traps in their
Right.
yards,
Yep.
and I did that. And certain areas had higher mosquito contents than others, and it was, there was areas that needed mowing and things like that, which also was done, and that reduced some of the
Right.
numbers as well.
Yeah.
But the species that I was getting in them was primarily salt marsh mosquitoes.
Yes.
Because I left the trap during the day. Because normally these traps get turned on at night and shut off in the morning.
Yeah.
So those are the species we're interested in getting to test. Are the night biters.
Yeah, so
So
let's-
salt marsh are day biters, so I
Yeah.
don't collect a lot of them
Right.
anyway.
So let's talk about the traps that you're using. I find that very fascinating. Maybe we can look at those pictures. We have a couple of different pictures of traps. What do we see here on this picture?
The trap on the left is a CDC carbon dioxide and light mixed trap. What it does is a little fan and a light on the top. The top of it is just a rainwater, it keeps the trap protected. The collection basket is underneath. So these are connected to these poles that we have. We have stations. So basically it's a traffic sign pole that these are mounted to. They also run off carbon dioxide gas. So we have tanks that sit there with tubing. The carbon dioxide gas is the same gas that we expel when we breathe. And it's the same component as what's in some auto exhaust. So sometimes
Right.
cars will attract, or propane will attract because the carbon.
Oh,
They like the
yeah.
carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide. So we use that gas plus the light option to attract mosquitoes to the trap, and then the fan collects them into the collection basket.
Okay.
And
Great.
that trap is used to collect mosquitoes that primarily bite mammals and humans.
Right. And then what did we see on this image?
This one is the right ear gravid trap. This trap, we put dirty, stinky water in the bottom. Basically, it's a hay infused. We take grass clippings or hay, soak it in water for a week, and it makes this vile smelling water, which mimics catch basin water, container water, things that are left unattended, flooded lawns if you don't, if you turn on your sprinkler, those types of things too much. And those attract mosquitoes that are the primary vectors for West Nile and birds. Those
Right.
are the bird biters. So what this trap does is the females are attracted to the dirty water in the pan. They fly in, go to lay their eggs in the water, the rafts, and instead of doing that, they get sucked into the collection net, and then we send those for testing. A lot of the mosquito pools that the state has being positive are a lot of these primary vectors.
Right.
These birds, these bird biters, give us an indicator of virus prevalence in an area. It doesn't mean those mosquitoes can bite or will bite people or infect them. It just gives us an early indication of what risk we're looking at, so we
Right.
can ramp up testing using the other traps to see what we have for human biting mosquitoes that may be flying around. So then we
Okay.
start doing more supplemental trapping,
Right.
more testing, send in those species that are, and then see what the results come back on those.
And you did testing and you never found a positive West Nile virus positive mosquito in our town this year. Is that
Nothing this
correct?
year, correct.
Nothing this year. Okay. All right. So I'd like to talk a little bit to Kelsey about what you do as a field technician from the Northeast Massachusetts Mosquito Control District to prevent mosquitoes from breeding, what efforts you are undertaking, and then also we'll talk a little bit about spraying for mosquitoes and when that is indicated and used.
Great. So we can start by discussing larviciding for catch basins. So first, to monitor Culex species, we will treat every single catch basin in each town in our district, which is quite a lot of manpower. And then in Winthrop also we do that. We drop these little packets that are just about like a little bit smaller than the size of your palm into each one, and it has about a 2-month effect, usually, give or take, to stopping any mosquito larvae from continuing breeding and becoming adult species. This drastically helps with reducing Culex amounts of mosquitoes.
What is contained in those packets? Can you talk about that?
Oh, so it is a bacterial larvicide we get.
So what does larvicide mean?
Larvicide stops the growth of mosquito larvae in the catch basin.
So those are immature mosquitoes
Yes,
that are,
before they become
developing
adult
in the
flying.
water.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're the baby mosquitoes pretty
Right.
much.
Okay. And so that has been done extensively in Winthrop this year, right?
Yes.
You've treated all the catch basins, and you also went to a lot of sites that were of concern, like abandoned lots with standing water in them.
Yes.
And treated those as well. Is that right?
Yes, we did that also.
And you also did a lot of surveillance this year where you went to these different areas and looked for mosquito breeding, and whenever you detected something, you retreated that area.
Correct.
Correct?
Yes.
Great. And so the larviciding effort is really what should be done first and foremost, other than, what residents themselves can do and towns can do to prevent containers and water collections in containers. Is what should be done to prevent breeding is larviciding. Is that correct?
Larviciding is definitely a great preventative that we really strive for every year. We start with freshwater larviciding of historical sites in the springtime every year. Our field techs go out to these historical sites. Residents can also call that are a part of the program, like in Winthrop.
Yes.
If they see standing water out at their house and they're worried about it, and it's not necessarily just a container they can flip over on their own. We can come out and check and even treat it if we're finding larvae, the baby mosquitoes again.
Right.
So that's a great way. And then the catch basin treatment, and then continuous larviciding. Larviciding on the salt marshes also.
Yes.
Those are great.
So we should absolutely encourage our residents to call you guys when they have concerns in their neighborhood, in their yard, or anywhere else in town that they're aware of anything where there's a standing water pool that you guys should come and test.
Yes.
And then treat it if necessary. So that is something that we encourage residents to do, or get in touch with the Board of Health or inspectional services, and then we'll get in touch with you guys so you can come and take care of those areas.
Yeah, because we really try to ask residents to call
Right.
when they see the standing water,
Right.
as opposed to when they're getting flying mosquitoes. Because
Right.
sometimes, because we only do spraying for flying mosquitoes as a preventative for virus or a reactionary effect to virus,
Correct.
we can't necessarily do anything if they're just being a nuisance.
Right.
And we'll come during the day when you're at work and just check the property. We have these nice little door knockers that we'll leave that have
Yes.
some nice preventative tips around with our phone number and contact information, so you'll know that we've been there. You can't really miss a bright
Right.
yellow door knocker.
Yes, and I should mention that we have obtained some informational materials from you that are available for residents to pick up at the health department with Deanna Ferretra at any time. If anyone is interested, we've also been giving them out at the I Love Winthrop Festival this year, and a lot of people were interested and have taken those little booklets and little pamphlets with them to know what to do and who to call. So let's talk a little bit about the adulticiding. So adulticiding means?
Adulticiding is what people commonly call as spraying, or we try to explain as it's a ULV, ultra low volume sprayer that's mounted on the bed of a pickup truck.
Yeah, so this is one of those trucks that you guys are driving around, similar to this, not necessarily the same color, but you know, about that. And they have this apparatus sitting on the back.
Yep, and that is
sprays.
one of our sprayers in the right corner. We use the product Zenovex E4. It has no PBOs in it, so it's...
What does PBO mean?
It's more of something in a chemical that's more toxic for the environment or the atmosphere. Yeah, for bees. Our products are applied at night, 30 minutes after sunset. No residual, so it won't stick to the vegetation, so it doesn't affect the bees' population foraging the next day, which is very big. We don't want to harm them. It really only it knocks down the flying populations of mosquitoes at that time.
At that time?
Yes.
And how long is it active? How many hours, minutes do you think it's active?
Really, just a few minutes. I go out and spray, and you'll see it out there floating, working, and it expands 300 feet. So the truck really does get good coverage. And then usually around 10, 15 minutes, it's already dissipated. It did its job.
Okay. So that means everything flying out after that time will not be affected. Is that correct?
No, it won't be effective.
So only the mosquitoes that are out in those 15 minutes will be affected by the spraying, and anything that would be flying around on the next day, or you know, would not be affected by it. So that would mean, you know, salt marsh mosquitoes,
if they're getting blown in on a daily basis,
unfortunately, are not really affected by this. Maybe some that are sitting around the height of the spraying fog, you know, might be killed by this, but you know, the vast majority will just be flying in the next day again. So there will not be any effect to the salt marsh mosquitoes. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Unfortunately, the products that we use are more based on public health concerns of lessening the result of West Nile virus rather than nuisance, which is tough. We can't completely eradicate mosquitoes, and we are very worried about the environment and very conscious of it. That's why we use the products that we do.
Yeah. So we have a policy in our town with you guys that states that we only really spray when we have virus concern, meaning when we have positive tested, you know, virus mosquitoes in our town. And we don't really spray for nuisance, especially because the nuisance that we did have this year was salt marsh mosquitoes, and they wouldn't really be affected. And we did spray one day in one area abutting the salt marshes, and you know, it gave maybe a day of relief, and then they were back. So there was no major effect. It was more sort of an experiment to see if that would maybe give the residents some relief, because they were very bothered by those mosquitoes, and I can attest to that. I went and took a hike there, and I got totally attacked. So I know how bad it was, and I can only, you know, imagine how bad it is to live in that area and not be able to use your back porch or anything. But unfortunately, there is really very little we can do about those salt marsh mosquitoes.
Right, and to clarify, we're spraying at night. Salt marsh mosquitoes are active during the day.
Correct.
So spraying for mosquitoes that are active during the day at night won't remove that issue.
Right.
So, you know, because we're not spraying vegetation, we're not using a residual spray.
Right.
So this stuff is used, the ultra low volume product is meant to loft in the atmosphere at night during warm weather periods. That's why we also can't apply this product when it's raining or when it drops below 58 degrees Fahrenheit. We need small particle sizes to go upward and outward.
Right.
So if we get colder, which is why even if we get virus, we can't do any spraying because the temperatures at night now are too cold.
Okay.
So we cease all adulticiding operations once the
Interesting.
temperature decreases.
Okay, but we should really get across the point that mosquitoes are active until the first hard frost. Is
Absolutely.
That right?
Yep.
So you could still get bitten even if it's cool outside. You know, they can still breed, they can still proliferate and carry the virus. So you really need to protect yourself until the first hard frost.
And we could do an adulticide spray for virus, which we have in some other towns.
Right.
But that it only reduces the risk for that little period of time because we try to knock it out of the, whatever mosquitoes there are at night
Right.
that may be virus mosquitoes. We do that spray, an emergency ULV spray, to try to get those mosquitoes out of the population. They're local mosquitoes. They're not being
Right.
blown in or flying in. They're kind of in that area. And again, we can still get someone with West Nile virus even though we've done that.
Right.
So, because there's still mosquitoes there, they just may not be all, each mosquito has to touch a droplet
Right.
of product.
Right.
And if the mosquito doesn't touch the droplet,
Yeah.
they won't die.
Right. But we
So-
never really had very high numbers of those mosquitoes to begin with.
Not,
so-
not this year. I didn't
Not
find
this
a lot.
year.
No,
Yeah.
Everything was larvicided pretty
Yeah.
well. We did a lot of
Okay.
preventative maintenance in Winthrop this year.
That's great.
So.
I'm very glad that you guys take good care of us.
You're welcome.
Okay. So let's go to the next slide because now we need to talk a little bit about what can our residents do to protect their loved ones. You know, we already said that obviously use of repellents, of insect repellents, is the most effective means to fight mosquitoes because if you don't get bitten, you can't get sick, right?
Correct. Correct.
So that is the most important thing that you can do. There are several approved mosquito repellents. You know, there's obviously DEET or DEET-based repellents. What other repellents are you aware of that people can use?
There's also a permethrin spray that you can treat clothing, picaridin, permethrin, that you can treat clothing with that'll last for a while. There's lemon eucalyptus oil, which has also been approved by the CDC.
Interesting. Okay. So there is a natural alternative to DEET
Right,
for
but just
people
because
that
it's
don't want to use
natural
DEET.
doesn't mean that it's not a chemical.
Right.
It's still a natural chemical, which
Right.
which is EPA approved for certain usages, and it's recommended that no matter what product you use, you have to make sure on the labeling it says prevention for West Nile virus and Lyme, like mosquito and tick-borne diseases,
Right.
because this will also help you with the many tick-borne diseases that we have
Right.
throughout the state,
Which are much
there's-
more
which
prevalent
are
than
more
West Nile
prevalent, and there's 8 or
virus.
9 of them.
Right.
So this is kind of a double action. Not only are you protecting yourself against Triple E and West Nile from mosquitoes, but you're also protecting yourself against the potential for picking up a tick you don't know about.
Right.
And getting any number of those tick-borne viruses, which you can still pick up in your yard as well.
Yeah.
So the CDC has a website you can go on, which we link on our website as well. There's age-appropriate products, there's timing, there's applications. So even young children can use repellents, but there's certain kinds and certain application
Right.
rates. And then we believe in the label is the law. You read the label, read it carefully, understand it, and then use the product. If you
Yes.
still have problems with understanding the label, you can always reach out to your pediatrician or your physician
That's
first,
actually a very good advice.
or
yes.
even call the CDC poison control, and they can help you. And we have all those phone numbers, not for your pediatrician and physician, but we do have numbers to reach out to
to the state.
to the state agency. Also, the Massachusetts Department of Health has a lot of outreach for these types of questions.
Right.
So if there's any question, instead of not knowing or not doing, just call and ask.
Okay, that's great advice. Thank you, Kim. Then the next point is that light color clothing will help along with long sleeved shirts and long pants. So mosquitoes are attracted to dark colors. Is that somewhat true, or?
Well, a lot of it mimics animals, or you know, so they're thinking maybe some of the darker colors may be more absorbing of light, or mosquitoes may be more attracted to it. It's hard to say. We have I hear different stories about people who could stand next to someone who gets eaten alive and they don't get bit at all. So there's a lot of body chemistry involved in
Right.
it, a lot of odor, movement. If you run and flail your arms, mosquitoes will tend to follow you more than if you just stand still and hold your breath. There's just a lot of things, but the other thing is for the light clothing is ticks, so you can see them. So they figure if you're going to go outside and recreate, they might come up with some prevention method that fits both
Yeah.
ticks and mosquitoes.
I
So the light
understand.
clothing and
Yeah.
stuff just makes it easily visible.
Okay, that's actually a good point, the visibility. Yes, okay. And then the next point is just to avoid being outdoors in, at the times of the days when these mosquitoes are active, which are for the virus-carrying mosquitoes.
Between the hours of dusk and dawn. So,
Okay.
and the other thing is as dusk gets earlier and earlier
Right.
as the time goes on. Also, make sure your kids are dressed appropriately at bus stops and things. Because some of these
Okay.
mosquitoes, bus stops may be in rural areas.
Right.
Make sure your kids are still dressed appropriately for the time of day, because they can still get bit at a bus stop. Or at soccer games. I mean, you may think you go to a football or soccer game. Nighttime sports starts in the fall.
Right.
So we have kind of a corresponding West Nile virus in human cases increase with also the prevalence of a lot of
Right.
nighttime sports at schools. So you still may want to, even if it's a half-hour practice or an hour-long game, consider the fact that when you're sitting on the bleachers, you're a target for getting
Right.
bitten,
Okay.
especially
Yeah.
in the fall.
Great point. Thank you. And then, obviously, what we already discussed, residents should get rid of all standing waters, puddles, potted plants, bird baths, old tires, leaky faucets, toys, and also clean your gutters, really. Make sure that they are not containing pine needles and are clogged, since that can be a great habitat for mosquitoes to breed.
Right.
Keep your lawns well manicured and not overwatered. That is another great point, where these species that transmit viruses, they like to breed in these lawn, or hang out in those areas.
Because they're nice and moist and they stay protected and cool.
Right.
Mosquitoes are little tiny water bodies that are floating
Right.
around. They don't want to be dried out by the sun or wind. So they try to find spots that are very moist and well shaded. So a long lawn that's not mowed with weeds
Will harbor
will
mosquitoes.
harbor mosquitoes during the daytime. So the
yeah.
minute you walk through it, you get not just mosquitoes, but you get grasshoppers and
Yeah.
butterflies and moths and everything else. So, and ticks.
Right.
So the best thing to do is keep your lawn manicured.
And that's why, the Board of Health has asked the town to mow all the common areas very well
Yes.
this year, so that we don't have even marsh mosquitoes attaching to grass and being there overnight, and then people walk
Right.
through and they disturb them, and of course then they bite.
I mean, you can keep
Yes.
the lawn at a length that'll keep it from drying out the turf, but that's not too long for insects. So,
Okay.
there is a good, a lot of your landscapers will know what length
Yeah.
you can keep it at
That
to
is
make
a
sure you don't dry
very
out your
interesting-
lawn, so you don't have to water it, but yet
Yes.
it won't breed
Right.
insects. So.
Wow, okay. And then obviously the last one, very important, repair your broken mosquito screens. We've seen a lot of houses with, rips in the mosquito screens, and that's where they are getting into your house, and they
Right.
will, hang out in your house and bite you at night. So that's another very important point.
Yeah. I mean, the great scenarios in the summer when people
Right.
complain the most is they're outside with the porch light on, the screen door open, cooking on the grill at
Propane
dusk.
gas.
Yeah.
So you have
also
propane
incre-
gas, you have a light on the porch, you're leaving your screen door open, and you're standing out there in shorts and a tank top.
Right.
So one of those things has to be,
It sounds great, but for
but
mosquito
you'll get eaten alive on the grill
control,
at that
it
time
is-
of night because
yeah.
the propane gas just attracts. I mean, you can.
Right.
They're just so you have to kind of take those things in consideration. That you're just bait.
Right.
It's a but it's hard. It's hard to be consciously aware that one mosquito anywhere.
Right.
Even pumping gas. So I mean, it is very difficult to say, am I going to wear repellent? But we give a time of year, and basically, you almost have to
Yeah.
if you're in that high risk group or if you're in a
Right.
high risk activity. We wear repellents and protective clothing all year.
Yes.
It's part of our daily activity, our routine. So.
Well, this was a great discussion. Thank you so much for coming and
thank you for
having
having
that
us. No,
conversation
thank you for
with
having
us.
us.
And again, the mosquito season lasts until the first hard frost. So this is, even though it's October, this is still a timely show
Absolutely.
To air. And for more information, you can always reach out to the Board of Health. Our email addresses are on the Winthrop town website. You can also call the health department. then also obviously you guys, you like to be contacted, so
love it.
there should be no hesitation when there are any questions or concerns to reach out to you. You will come to people's houses, you will test their backyards, you will do larviciding if necessary, and you will also report back to us so we have a better understanding where active mosquito breeding is happening in town. So this is a very important collaboration.
Right, and we also recommend people reach out to the website for the State Department of Health, because they offer a lot of educational materials and assistance for those for results and everything
Right.
else. So we rely on the Massachusetts Department of Health for many resources for us.
Yeah.
And also to put in, if you are not interested in any applications of products on your yard, I forgot to mention earlier, for
That's
spray
true. We
exclusions
should-
or pesticide exclusions.
Yes.
We do keep a database of that on hand at all times. We know those areas that don't want them. We don't want to have anyone feel invaded, so we keep note of that and we avoid those areas.
Yes, so there is a way to opt out of the spraying if we do spray. For residents that have concerns about that, they can go to your website and they can find out more information. They need to file a form with the
state.
Department of Agriculture Resources.
Correct, and that has to be done at least 2 weeks prior to the spraying, is my understanding. But it's
Right.
valid
Yeah.
for the whole season. So I encourage everyone who doesn't want to have spraying done near their house to fill out this form, and then you guys will turn off the sprayer in
Yes.
front of that address, and then turn it back on after you get to the next.
And
when
they
you
have
get
to
the
be
next
owners of the
house.
home too. They have to be
Yeah.
the property
So
owners
tenants
or
can
renting.
unfortunately not do it.
Tenants can, as long as we know who the landlord
Who the
is, so we
landlord
can
is.
get a hold of the landlord.
And
the form will
verify
have
that.
the
Okay.
information on there. So
Okay.
as long as they fill out the form appropriately with the landlord-tenant information, we'll be able to do that
To
for
get
them.
in touch. Oh, great.
But yeah, it's on our website
Yeah,
under
very
resident
important
services.
information we don't want to omit here.
Yes.
Well, okay, thank you very much
thank
for
you.
coming, and
Yeah, thank you for having us.
we'll
you
hopefully
next
next
year.
year will not be as bad as this year, and we don't have the Marsh mosquito problem.
I hope so too.
me
Okay,
too.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.